the tariff thing has to be seen in the same context of what was just discussed by Mr. Sood and Mr. Panda, which is that we've got to think about it in terms of the fact that nobody actually wants you to succeed and take over. They are happy with you to become a little bit richer, a little bit of a bigger market for their products, but certainly not the Eastern ascent, phenomena that threatens the cake, the way the cake was being cut up. In this context, let me say that we are not even unique in this. Since we have now some pretensions of becoming a world power by the end of the decade and the next decade, whatever increase, then let us be very clear that whenever this change happened, whoever sort of became the great power and became accepted as such had to fight their way there. So let's look through the last several hundreds of years of history. For the British to become a serious world power, they not only had to get past Spain, they also had to defeat Napoleon. For the Russians to become a great power, they had to hold their own in Crimea against both the French and the British. For the Germans to emerge, they had to win the Franco-Prussian Wars. For Japan, they had to defeat Russia in 1905. America had to win 2 world wars. China had to hold their own against America in Korea and then in Vietnam. Tariff wars, we're getting it cheap. So, of course, things may get much nastier, but if this is all that we have to put up with for the next few years, and of course, we don't know if we'll get lucky with the Supreme Court of the US, but assuming we don't, we should be prepared mentally that this space will have to be taken in some fashion. Now,
nobody's going to give it to you.
Nobody's going to give it to us. Now, hopefully we don't actually have to fight a war, but a tariff war should be considered part of the journey. Yeah, and information wars and many other things that will be played along with us. Whether our neighborhood is used to box us in, whether and there is a section here on, let me remember what the exact term Mr. Sood used, which is subversion of the mind. That's the one. There will be many attempts using artificial intelligence, social media, various complicit groups inside India whose political affiliation, interests may lie in causing turbulence. So, in all of this, we should be very clear that this will not be handed to us in a clean, neat way. In every single one.
There is no handover of the baton.
There is no handover of the baton. Nobody is particularly happy about the fact that we are rising. People may wish us well to the extent that we have removed poverty and so on. But beyond that, when it really comes to real power in the game, then be very, very clear that you have to push your way and make space. Now, this has to be done carefully. If you go around pushing around too much, that people will gang up against you, or at the end, they are still bigger boys than you who will trample you. On the other hand, if you don't push around a little bit at least and make space, then, even past powers will push you around. So this is a game that we have to play, but we have to be willing to play it.
So let me, since you mentioned subversion of the mind, and you mentioned, and this book really is about, the self-description of who we are. Are we in 21st century India beginning to describe ourselves more clearly and with more lucidity?
Yes, in a sense, yes. You see, we bought in after independence. What happens when countries usually become independent? They tend, especially in the beginning, to have a very strong sense of themselves. And they become free. They tend to evict from positions of the national conversation people who had been collaborators with the colonial power, whoever occupied them. For the French, for example, got rid of all the Nazi collaborators and so on very, very quickly, as indeed did the Indonesians and so on. One of the unique things of India is that having become independent, the intellectual class of independent India were not those who necessarily fought for India's independence. A very small number of them were there. Most of those who became India's intellectual class after independence were direct descendants of those who had collaborated with the British. They mostly were already in the system. They knew English better or whatever. And in fact, they were the biggest beneficiaries. All the top bosses left, so these people got promoted up. Now, there was a problem because if India had been a great power, and it had been a great nation and from ancient times and so on, and as Nehru had described, a nation much suppressed, finding utterance, then their self-image was that they had been traitors. So therefore, what they did is they reformulated, using Marxist language, a vision in which effectively India as a country didn't exist before 1947. This is what, by the way, the colonials were telling us anyway. Now, most countries will throw it out as soon as they became free. For our intellectual class, this actually became a useful prop. So we are a strange country in that, having become independent, we perpetuated all these colonial era tropes. Now, of course, it suited the Nehruvian elite as well, who had, to be fair to them, had participated in the freedom struggle. But it suited them because it meant that now, you see, the nation itself exists because of us. So, of course, there is the father of the nation, but then there can also be Chacha of the nation. You can even have Damad of the nation. So, therefore, you see, what happens here is that it is only now that we are beginning to rediscover our history as a country. A sense of self is being actively built upon. We are actually beginning to rewrite our history textbooks in a way that self-respecting country should have done in 1947 onwards. We are beginning to have these kinds of conversations in a much more active way than we would have had just not so long ago.